The opening chapter in our 10-part chronicle of Firelink Shrine begins not with the stones of the ruin, but with the primal root of its existence. This is the narrative architectural anchor, where the physical architecture of the world's most famous sanctuary is revealed as a natural pedestal perched precariously atop the Great Hollow. Within the weathered cliffs and the gnarled roots, Firelink Shrine serves as the geological nerve center of Lordran. The lore of this era is the lore of the structural nexus. Its purpose was the creation of a transit point between the heavens and the earth. The history of Firelink's foundation is the history of the threshold of the surface, where the gray stone of the surface world meets the infinite depth of the arch trees. This is the tragedy of the precipice, proving that safety is a thin crust supported by the shattered skeleton of a dead age. The lore of the Archtree Ascent provides the structural foundation for this chapter's isolation. Firelink Shrine is not a destination. It is a platform situated at the highest reachable point of a massive, petrified tree trunk. The lore suggests that the shrine is a stump of history. Its purpose was the observation of the world's verticality. From this vantage point, the chosen undead can see the lower berg, the undead parish, and the void of the new Londo entrance, representing the juncture where all paths bleed into one. This reveals the strategic purpose of the shrine's placement. The gods built this hub at the heart of the world to ensure that all pilgrims must pass through the center of the storm. This was the era of the High Root. This shows that the history of Firelink is a history of the intersection, which binds the high and the low with gravity. The physical environment of the Firelink cliffs provides insight into the atmospheric loneliness of the fall. This is a graveyard of the sky, battered by eternal winds and salt air, representing the stagnation of the elements. The lore of the weathered stone explains that its purpose was the visual documentation of time's passage. Unlike the golden marble of Aner Londo, Firelink is dilapidated, cracked, and overgrown, proving that the gods abandoned the surface to focus on their gilded heights. This reveals the melancholic purpose of the ruin. It is a mirror of the undead condition, functional but broken, permanent but decaying. This was the era of the crumbling arch. This shows that the history of the cliffs is a history of the erosion, which exposes the bone of the world. The relationship between the bonfire and the alchemical heart represents the biological warmth within the fall. At the center of the shrine sits a bonfire fueled by the bones of the undead, representing the last sanctuary of the fading flame. The lore suggests that the fire is a life support system. Its purpose was the reclamation of the soul's vitality. By resting at the hearth, the undead recharge their estus and reset their fate, proving that Firelink is the womb of the cycle. This reveals the parasitic purpose of the shrine's heart. The peace of the sanctuary is bought with the ash of those who died to kindle it. This was the era of the coiled sword. This shows that the history of the bonfire is a history of the sustenance, which keeps the corpse moving toward the end. Furthermore, the lore of the crestfallen warrior and the psychological erosion represents the mental toll of the fall. The first being Max, or rather, the player encounters is the crestfallen warrior, a shadow of a hero who has given up. The lore suggests that the warrior is a warning. Its purpose was the humanization of failure. By sitting at the fire and refusing to move, he represents the final destination of all undead who lose their purpose. This reveals the prophetic purpose of the shrine's inhabitants. Firelink is a waiting room for the hollow. This was the era of the sarcastic sigh. This shows that the history of the inhabitant is a history of the resignation, which drowns the spark in apathy. The relationship between the crow, Snuggly's kin, and the divine transport represents the vertical migration within the fall. A giant crow transports the chosen undead from the asylum to the shrine, representing the hand of Velka or the gods reaching into the dark. The lore suggests that the crow is a ferryman, Its purpose was the circumvention of the impossible geography. By carrying the prophecy to the shrine, the bird ensured that the cycle could continue even when the staircases were broken. This reveals the mythological purpose of the flight. The chosen enter Lordran not as conquerors, but as scavengers dropped from the sky. This was the era of the black feathers. The history of the crow is the history of the delivery, which deposits the burden at the altar. The lore of the hidden graveyard and the proximity of the dead represents the interconnected mortality within the fall. Just feet away from the comfort of the fire lies a field of skeletons, representing the fact that in Lordran, rest is always interrupted. The lore suggests that the graveyard is a leak of the catacombs. Its purpose was the physical encroachment of the deep. This reveals the nihilistic purpose of the shrine's border. You are never more than a few steps from the grave. This was the era of the rising bone. This shows that the history of the graveyard is a history of the pressure, which pushes the living toward the cliff. The act concludes with the silent observation of Anastasia of Astora, the firekeeper, trapped in her cell beneath the grate, realizing that she is the literal foundation of the shrine's flame. The purpose of the geological anchor lore was to be the universal exposure of the fragility of sanctuary. It shows that home is a ruin. The player realizes that they have arrived at a station, not a kingdom. The rise of the undead mission is the final movement of the Foundation lore, proving that in the world of Dark Souls, Firelink is not a reward, it is a crossroad that is written in the dust of the forgotten. The legacy of the shrine's roots in this chapter is the horror of the structural nexus. We realize that safety was a weathered illusion and hope was a gnarled root that the gods used to anchor the cursed to the mountain. The purpose of the workshop of the root was to cradle the prophecy, and the fall was the isolation of the nexus. As the wind howls through the arches and the bonfire hisses in the mist, hearing the clatter of the skeletons awakening in the grass, they understand that the history of Firelink is the history of the anchor, an anchor that holds the soul to the earth but leaves the heart to wait for the dark. The second chapter in our 10-part chronicle of Firelink Shrine descends into the subterranean martyrdom of the sanctuary's heart. This is the narrative sacrificial foundation, where the physical architecture of the shrine, specifically the iron-barred grotto beneath the bonfire, is revealed as a prison of necessity. Within the damp stone and the shadowed alcove, Anastasia of Astora witnesses the final degradation of her service. The lore of this era is the lore of the human vessel. Its purpose was the somatic maintenance of the divine hearth. The history of the firekeeper is the history of the clipped tongue, where a saint was mutilated and bound to ensure that the undead would always have a warmth to return to. This is the tragedy of the living battery, proving that light is not a grace, but a fluid extracted from the suffering of the devoted. The lore of the firekeeper's biology provides the alchemical foundation for this chapter's isolation. Firekeepers are not mere tenders of the flame. They are corporeal manifestations of the bonfire itself, their infinite humanity acting as a wick for the light. The lore suggests that the keeper is a corrupted holy thing. Its purpose was the filtration of the cursed blood. By eating the humanity offered by pilgrims, the keeper refines it into Estus, proving that the shrine's peace is a metabolic process. This reveals the gouging purpose of the bond. The fire doesn't burn wood, it consumes the sanity and soul of the woman in the cage. This was the era of the bound maiden. This shows that the history of Anastasia is a history of the parasitism, which feeds the world by starving the individual. The physical environment of the firekeeper's cell provides insight into the institutionalized agony of the fall. This is a cold grotto hollowed out from the archtree root, representing the distance between the god's glory and the reality of their tools. The lore of the iron grate explains that its purpose was the prevention of the martyr's flight. Anastasia is forbidden from speaking and forbidden from leaving her legs likely broken or sinews severed to ensure she remains the stationary power source for the shrine. This reveals the cruel purpose of the divine architecture. The shrine is a temple for the undead, but it is a dungeon for the keeper. This was the era of the severed tongue. This shows that the history of the grotto is a history of the exploitation, which cloaks torture in the robes of sacredness. The relationship between the firekeeper soul and the transmutation of power represents the spiritual currency within the fall. To strengthen the Estus flask, one must offer the souls of fallen keepers to the living. The lore suggests that the soul is a conduit of endless humanity. Its purpose was the upgrading of the undead's resilience. This reveals the cannibalistic purpose of the sanctuary. The chosen undead survives by consuming the essence of those who died guarding other fires. This was the era of the Golden Estus. The history of the Firekeeper soul is the history of the transfusion, which pumps the vitality of the fallen into the veins of the Slayer. Furthermore, the lore of the sin of Astora and the self-imposed guilt represents the internal sabotage within the fall. Anastasia believes she is impure, accepting her mutilation as penance for a crime that is never fully named. The lore suggests that guilt is the perfect chain. Its purpose was the psychological enforcement of the bond. By convincing the keeper that she deserves her cage, the Way of White ensured she would never resist her fate. This reveals the manipulative purpose of the divine faith. The gods control the keepers not through steel, but through shame. This was the era of the silent prayer. This shows that the history of Anastasia is a history of the gaslighting, which turns the victim into their own jailer. The relationship between Knight Lautrec of Karim and the fragility of the shrine represents the lethal vulnerability within the fall. Residing just outside the cell, the Knight in Brass plots the murder of the keeper to harvest her soul. The lore suggests that the shrine is an open target. Its purpose was the demonstration of the moral decay. Even in the heart of the sanctuary, violence is inevitable, proving that the gods can no longer protect their own hearth. This reveals the predatory purpose of the favor armor. In the world of Dark Souls, gold is polished with the blood of the innocent. This was the era of the Shotel. The history of Lautrec is the history of the betrayal, which extinguishes the sun to satisfy the ego. The lore of the Black Eye Orb and the justice of the Void represents the extrajudicial recovery within the fall. After Anastasia is killed, the Firelink bonfire goes cold, forcing the undead to hunt her soul in the city of the gods. The lore suggests that the orb is an interdimensional compass. Its purpose was the retribution against the defiler. This reveals the restorative purpose of the hunt. To restore the shrine, the Slayer must invade the heaven of Aner Londo to reclaim the battery. This was the era of the Blue Phantom. This shows that the history of the orb is a history of the dead, which requires death to reignite the home. The act concludes with the silent observation of Anastasia's restoration, as she returns to her cage with her voice briefly restored, only to beg for silence because she is ashamed of being human. The purpose of the Silent Guardian lore was to be the universal exposure of the necessity of the martyr. It shows that comfort is exploitation. The player realizes that the shrine is breathless without the suffering of the keeper. The rise of the restored flame is the final movement of the keeper lore, proving that in the world of Dark Souls, sanctuary is not a right, it is a burden that is borne on the back of the broken. The legacy of the Firekeeper in this chapter is the horror of the sacrificial foundation. We realize that safety was a damp scream and light was a chemical theft that the Way of White used to lubricate the cycle of the prophecy. The purpose of the workshop of the cell was to house the agony, and the fall was the degradation of the human saint. As the keeper curls into a ball behind the bars and the bonfire roars with stolen vitality, hearing the clinking of her chains in the dark, They understand that the history of Firelink is the history of the victim, a victim that sustains the world, but is refused a place in its sun. The third chapter in our 10-part chronicle of Firelink Shrine examines the stagnant soul that greets every pilgrim at the hearth. This is the narrative psychological mirror, where the physical architecture of the shrine's central seating, a weathered stone wing, becomes the throne of apathy. Within the dying embers and the constant sighs, the crestfallen warrior witnesses the final erosion of his own will. The lore of this era is the lore of the defeated predecessor. Its purpose was the observation of the undead inevitability. The history of the Sentinel is the history of the first abandonment, where a warrior of exceptional skill surrendered to the weight of the world, choosing to rot in the sunlight rather than suffer in the dark. This is the tragedy of the broken spirit, proving that hollow is not just a biological state, but a mental decision made when the horizon offers nothing but ash. The lore of the crestfallen condition provides the sociological foundation for this chapter's despair. The warrior is the ghost of the future for the chosen undead. The lore suggests that the crestfallen is a necessary anchor. Its purpose was the grounding of the prophecy in reality. By sitting at the shrine and mocking the new arrivals, the warrior serves as a living documentation of the failure rate of the undead mission. This reveals the dampening purpose of his presence. He is the antibody of the shrine, attempting to kill the hope of the pilgrim before the world does it more violently. This was the era of the blue cloak. This shows that the history of the Sentinel is a history of the static, which fills the silence with the sound of giving up. The physical environment of the central hearth provides insight into the atmospheric fatigue of the fall. This is the safety zone where violence is suppressed by divine law, representing the false security of the shrine. The lore of the sitting stone explains that its purpose was the manifestation of the eternal weight. The warrior has sat in this exact spot for so long that he has become part of the architecture, a human monument to exhaustion. This reveals the nihilistic purpose of the hearth's design. It invites the undead to stop moving, proving that the shrine is as much a trap for the soul as it is a sanctuary for the body. This was the era of the chainmail. This shows that the history of the hearth is a history of the sediment, which settles the debris of ambition at the bottom of the mountain. The relationship between the information broker and the map of despair represents the lethal guidance within the fall. The warrior tells the player about the two bells of awakening, representing his residual knowledge of a quest he once pursued. The lore suggests that the directions are gallows humor. Its purpose was the steering of the lamb to the slaughter. By pointing the undead toward the blight town and the parish, he participates in the cycle he claims to despise, ensuring that another soul is fed into the machinery of the gods. This reveals the complicit purpose of the warrior's knowledge. The crestfallen is the usher of the abyss, opening the door because he is too tired to walk through it himself. This was the era of the two bells. The history of the guidance is the history of the script, which recycles the victim. Furthermore, the lore of the new Londo trauma and the source of the fear represents the specific scars within the fall. The warrior expresses terror at the smell of the new Londo ruins and Framp's breath, representing his close encounter with the true dark. The lore suggests that Crestfallen is a survivor of the abyss. Its purpose was the warning against the primordial truth. This reveals the traumatic purpose of his isolation. He stays at the shrine because he knows what is underneath it. This was the era of the sunken ghost. This shows that the history of the Sentinel is a history of the cowardice, which presents fear as wisdom. The relationship between Kingseeker Frampt and the final breaking point represents the trigger of the hollowing within the fall. When the serpent appears, the warrior's sanctuary is violated by the divine presence, forcing him to flee to New Londo. The lore suggests that the appearance was a psychological eviction. Its purpose was the the displacement of the reluctant inhabitant. By moving from the light to the dark, the warrior finally lost his last sliver of sanity, proving that Firelink only functions as long as the truth stays asleep. This reveals the ironic purpose of the serpent's arrival. The messenger of the gods created a hollow in the heart of the holy place. This was the era of the stinking breath. The history of the displacement is the history of the end, which pushes the spectator into the pit. The lore of the hollow duel and the erasure of identity represents the finality of the fall within the narrative. The player eventually meets the warrior in New Londo, but he has lost his mind, becoming a mindless attacker. The lore suggests that the fight is a mercy. Its purpose was the termination of the stagnant loop. By killing the warrior, the chosen undead absorbs the remainder of his failure, clearing the seat at the shrine for the next victim. This reveals the sequential purpose of the Sentinel's death. In the world of Dark Souls, the old hollow must make room for the new burn. This was the era of the longsword. This shows that the history of the duel is a history of the inheritance, which buys progress with the death of experience. The act concludes with the silent observation of the empty seat at the shrine, as the dust settles on the stone where the warrior once sat, realizing that nobody remembers his name. The purpose of the crestfallen Sentinel lore was to be the universal exposure of the fragility of purpose. It shows that will is finite. The player realizes that they are walking in the footsteps of a ghost. The rise of the hollowed warrior is the final movement of the Sentinel lore, proving that in the world of Dark Souls, sanity is not a fact, it is a reservoir that is drained by the gravity of the shrine. The legacy of the crestfallen warrior in this chapter is the horror of the abandoned spirit. We realize that safety was a numbing stagnation and cynicism was a shield that the Sentinel used to hide his grief from the sun. The purpose of the workshop of the seat was to display the defeat, and the fall was the erasure of the individual. As the wind whispers through the empty arch and the bonfire flickers without its guardian, hearing the echo of his last sigh in the cold air, they understand that the history of Firelink is the history of the mirror, a mirror that reflects the Slayer and leaves the world to watch the hollow walk alone. The fourth chapter in our 10-part chronicle of Firelink Shrine records the theological intrusion of the deep. This is the narrative serpentine orchestration, where the physical architecture of the sanctuary is ruptured by the arrival of an ancient, primordial entity from the abyssal basement. Within the shattered floorboards and the sunken pool, Kingseeker Frampt witnesses the final activation of his long game. The lore of this era is the lore of the divine mouthpiece. Its purpose was the conversion of the sanctuary into a recruitment center. The history of the Kingseeker is the history of the Great Persuasion, where a friend of Lord Gwyn emerges from the sludge to charm the undead into volunteering for incineration. This is the tragedy of the Silver Tongue, proving that guidance is a hook that pulls the soul toward the furnace of the gods. The lore of the primordial anatomy provides the biological foundation for this chapter's unease. Frampt is not a dragon, nor a beast, but a serpent of infinite length and stinking breath, representing the hidden and ugly roots of the world. The lore suggests that the serpent is an architect of narratives. Its purpose was the filtering of the worthy soul. By waiting in the chamber beneath the shrine, Frampt operated as a gatekeeper, sifting through humanity to find a vessel strong enough to link the fire. This reveals the predatory purpose of the Kingseeker's form. The gods used a monster to tell a holy lie. This was the era of the clicking teeth. This shows that the history of Frampt is a history of the disguise, which cloaks extinction in the language of duty. The physical environment of the submerged altar provides insight into the subterranean despair of the fall. This is a flooded basement that connects the shrine to the kiln of the first flame, representing the secret wiring of the universe. The lore of the hidden stairwell explains that its purpose was the tactical isolation of the throne. Only those who possess the Lord Vessel are granted passage, proving that Firelink is merely the lid on a giant sacrificial urn. This reveals the mechanical purpose of the shrine's design. It is a funnel built to direct the flow of souls down into the dark. This was the era of the Lord Vessel. This shows that the history of the altar is a history of the conduit, which drains the surface to feed the depths. The relationship between the feeding of items and the alchemical consumption represents the metabolic greed within the fall. Frampt consumes items and equipment in exchange for souls, representing his ability to break down the physical into the spiritual. The lore suggests that the feeding is an economic distraction. Its purpose was the integration of the undead into the divine economy. By cleaning the inventory of the player, Frampt makes himself useful, building a trust that masks his ultimate goal of sacrifice. This reveals the manipulative purpose of the serpent's appetite. The god buys your loyalty with the scraps of your own journey. This was the era of the crashing jaw. The history of the feeding is the history of the digestion, which turns waste into will. Furthermore, the lore of the ancient alliance and the betrayal of the kin represents the political divide within the fall. While the archdragons were sovereign, the serpents allied with Gwyn, representing the imperfect traitors of the old world. The lore suggests that Frampt is a sanctioned parasite. Its purpose was the preservation of the status quo. By betraying his nature to serve the Sun King, Frampt ensured his own survival in the Age of Fire. This reveals the opportunistic purpose of the serpent's presence. The messenger is a vulture waiting for the gods to fall, so he can manage the estate. This was the era of the primordial deal. This shows that the history of the Alliance is a history of the turncoat, which sells the past for a seat at the table. The relationship between the sleeping serpent and the temporal exhaustion represents the fatigue of the eternal within the fall. When the player arrives too late or disappoints him, Frampt slumbers, his snoring rumbling through the stone like an earthquake. The lore suggests that the sleep is a vigil of boredom. Its purpose was the containment of information during the gap. Frampt has seen countless undead fail, proving that to the serpent, the chosen one is merely a statistic in a long wait. This reveals the indifferent purpose of the serpent's character. The prophecy is a routine to him, a game played to kill the infinite boredom of the abyss. This was the era of the heavy eyelid. The history of the slumber is the history of the repetition, which blurs the hero into the background. The lore of the Lord Vessel and the geological key represents the final validation within the narrative. Once placed, the vessel unlocks the golden fog across the world, proving that Firelink is the remote control of Lordran. The lore suggests that the vessel is a divine battery. Its purpose was the convergence of the great souls. By placing the vessel at the altar, the undead becomes the key that opens the door to the end, proving that safety was only a prerequisite for destruction. This reveals the instrumental purpose of the sanctuary. The shrine exists to hold the key until the hand arrives. This was the era of the Golden Bowl. This shows that the history of the altar is a history of the lock, which keeps the world frozen until the sacrifice is ready. The act concludes with the silent observation of Frampt's disappearance. If the player betrays him for the abyss, realizing that the serpent was never a guide, but a recruiter. The purpose of the Kingseeker's Maw lore was to be the universal exposure of the manipulation of the prophecy. It shows that wisdom is agenda. The player realizes that Firelink is a theatrical stage managed by a monster. The rise of the Lord Vessel is the final movement of the serpent lore, proving that in the world of Dark Souls, guidance is not a gift, it is a tether that is wrapped around the throat of the chosen. The legacy of the Kingseeker in this chapter is the horror of the serpentine orchestration. We realize that trust was a stinking bait and duty was a narrative trap that Frampt used to anchor the undead to the god's will. The purpose of the workshop of the altar was to process the soul, and the fall was the corruption of the sanctuary's intent. As the serpent hisses his promises, and the Lord vessel glows with stolen heat, hearing the sloshing of the water in the dark basement, they understand that the history of Firelink is the history of the maw, a maw that swallows the hero and leaves the world to wait for the next mouthful. The 5th chapter in our 10-part chronicle of Firelink Shrine shifts the focus from primordial monsters to the polished rot of human institution. This is the narrative ecclesiastical betrayal, where the physical architecture of the shrine's secondary wing, the crumbling cloister adjacent to the elevator, is revealed as a den of predators. Within the hollowed arches and the flickering torches, Petrus of Thorolund witnesses the final decay of his order's integrity. The lore of this era is the lore of the hallowed priesthood. Its purpose was the establishment of a bureaucratic presence at the threshold of the gods. The history of the Thorolund mission is the history of the false pilgrimage, where holy men used the prophecy as a cover for cowardice, greed, and abduction. This is the tragedy of the tainted miracles, proving that faith is a uniform worn to disguise the vulture. The lore of the Way of White and the Undead Hunt provides the political foundation for this chapter's darkness. Based in the land of Thorolund, this church engineered the ritual of kindling to turn undead into fuel. The lore suggests that the church is a processing plant for souls. Its purpose was the tactical management of the curse. By sending their holy pilgrims to Lordran, they ensured that the gods remained in power while the undead were isolated and consumed. This reveals the systemic purpose of the shrine's clerical presence. The gods required human enforcers to shepherd the sacrifice. This was the era of the White Circlet. This shows that the history of Petrus is a history of the butcher, who sharps his blade while praying for the lamb. The physical environment of the shrine cloister provides insight into the theological stagnation of the fall. This is a lobby of the divine where miracles are sold for souls, representing the mercenary nature of the Way of White. The lore of the elevator shaft explains that its purpose was the physical separation of the clergy from the parish below. While the undead rot in the burg, the Thorolund elite sit in the shrine, waiting for others to clear the path. This reveals the parasitic purpose of the clerical layout. The faith does not lead, it follows the strong to claim the glory. This was the era of the Morning Star. This shows that the history of the cloister is a history of the waiting room, where divine service becomes strategic inaction. The relationship between Petrus and the murderous avarice represents the moral rot within the fall. While he presents as a humble servant, Petrus is a hollowed opportunist who abandons and later murders the maiden Rhea to secure his own position. The lore suggests that Petrus is the death of sincerity. Its purpose was the demonstration of the corruption of the sacred. By killing a maiden in the darkness of the catacombs or the shrine, he proved that the church's miracles were nothing more than magic fueled by sin. This reveals the malignant purpose of his service. The cleric is the dark hand of the sun, ensuring that no pure soul survives to challenge the structure. This was the era of the hidden knife. The history of Petrus is the history of the Judas, which sells the maiden for a bag of souls. Furthermore, the lore of the maiden Rhea and the tragic purity represents the vulnerability of the faithful within the fall. Accompanied by her bodyguards, Vince and Nico, Rhea comes to Firelink to find the rite of kindling, representing the genuine hope that the church exploits. The lore suggests that Rhea is the sacrificial lamb of Thorolund. Its purpose was the illustration of the futility of good intentions. By trusting her superior, Petrus, she guaranteed her own ruin, showing that in Lordran, innocence is a sickness that is cured by betrayal. This reveals the nihilistic purpose of the pilgrimage. The church sends its best to die so the worst can rule. This was the era of the ivory talisman. This shows that the history of Rhea is a history of the morning, which ends in a cage in the archives. The relationship between Vince, Nico, and the loss of identity represents the militarization of the spirit within the fall. Once noble knights, they follow the maiden into the catacombs, only to be tricked by patches and turned hollow. The lore suggests that the bodyguard is a broken shield. Its purpose was the physical enforcement of a flawed journey. By attacking the woman they vowed to protect, they proved that the abyss and the hollow state rewrite the oaths of the holy. This reveals the ghoulish purpose of their fall. Even the faithful become the monsters they fear when the light of the sun fails. This was the era of the mace. The history of the bodyguards is the history of the rupture, which turns brothers into blades. The lore of the miracles and the echoes of the gods represents the vocal remnants within the narrative. In the shrine, the player buys spells that are stories of the lords, representing the idea that magic is memory. The lore suggests that the miracle is oral tradition as weaponry. Its purpose was the standardization of divine thought. By memorizing the tales of Gwyn or Guinevere, the undead becomes a vehicle for the Lord's history, proving that the Way of White controls the past to direct the present. This reveals the documentary purpose of the spells. The church doesn't teach truth, it teaches conformity. This was the era of the Great Heal. This shows that the history of the miracle is a history of the propaganda, which uses the soul as a script. The act concludes with the silent observation of Petrus, standing alone in the shrine after the maiden has vanished, smirking as he offers absolution for souls, realizing that he is the true master of the ruined sanctuary. The purpose of the Way of White's hub lore was to be the universal exposure of the corruption of the institution. It shows that sanctity is a lie. The player realizes that Firelink is infested with men worse than monsters. The rise of the Hallowed Cleric is the final movement of the clerical lore, proving that in the world of Dark Souls, faith is not a rescue, it is a business that is written in the tears of the abandoned. The legacy of the Way of White in this chapter is the horror of the ecclesiastical betrayal. We realize that purity was a marketable commodity and prayer was a distraction that Petrus used to anchor his victims to the knife. The purpose of the workshop of the cloister was to organize the slaughter, and the fall was the rot of the human order. As the shadows lengthen over the altar and the maiden cries in the dark, hearing the laughter of the cleric echoing through the shrine, they understand that the history of Firelink is the history of the vulture, a vulture that feasts on the faithful and leaves the world to starve for the divine. The 6th chapter in our 10-part chronicle of Firelink Shrine shifts from the corrupt clergy to the sanctuary of the mind. This is the narrative academic migration, where the physical architecture of the shrine's lower ruins, the mossy steps leading toward the new Londo elevator, becomes a temporary academy for the displaced scholars of Vinheim. Within the drafty arches and piled parchments, Griggs of Vinheim and his master Big Hat Logan witness the final fragility of human logic. The lore of this era is the lore of the sorceress pursuit. Its purpose was the observation of the soul through the lens of logic. The history of the Vinheim refugees is the history of the displaced intellectual, where magic is not a gift from the gods, but a science of the soul that requires a quiet corner to flourish amidst the chaos. This is the tragedy of the obsessive mind, proving that knowledge is a beacon that blinds the seeker to the reality of the hollow. The lore of the Vinheim Dragon School provides the institutional foundation for this chapter's migration. This University of Magic standardized the use of soul sorceries, representing the human effort to quantify the power of the flame. The lore suggests that the Dragon School is an empire of information. Its purpose was the industrialization of arcane warfare. By sending their spies and scholars into Lordran, they sought to recover the lost secrets of Seth the Scaleless. This reveals the mercenary purpose of the shrine sorcerers, The Academy doesn't seek enlightenment, it seeks efficiency. This was the era of the bellowing dragon crest. This shows that the history of Griggs is a history of the assistant, who carries the weight of the master's ambition. The physical environment of the lower stairwell provides insight into the makeshift despair of the fall. This is a classroom of the dispossessed located at the edge of a cliff, representing the precariousness of intellectualism in a dying world. The lore of the abandoned great explains that its purpose was the spatial demonstration of the scholar's priority. Griggs sits in the dirt, just to be near the path Logan took, proving that for the sorcerer, environment is secondary to curiosity. This reveals the ascetic purpose of the shrine scholars. The mind can create a library out of a ruin. This was the era of the slumbering dragon crest. This shows that the history of the lower stairs is a history of the vigil, where logic attempts to ignore the wind. The relationship between Big Hat Logan and the divine autonomy represents the secular pride within the fall. A legendary sorcerer who refuses to associate with gods, Logan represented the ultimate human potential. The lore suggests that Logan is the antithesis of faith. Its purpose was the demonstration of the sovereignty of the intellect. By leaving the shrine to infiltrate the archives, he proved that humanity could steal the knowledge of the divine. This reveals the hubristic purpose of his quest. The scholar doesn't want to link the fire, he wants to explain it. This was the era of the soul spear. The history of Logan is the history of the hat, which shields the thinker from the distraction of the sky. Furthermore, the lore of Griggs and the burden of the protege represents the subservient decay within the fall. Trapped in the lower berg, until rescued by the player, Griggs returns to the shrine only to wait for a master who has already forgotten him. The lore suggests that Griggs is the acolyte of an empty chair. Its purpose was the illustration of the human need for attachment. By teaching the player the basics of magic, he attempts to replicate the structure of the school in the middle of the end. This reveals the pathetic purpose of his instruction. The sorcerer clings to academic rank because he is terrified of being alone with the dark. This was the era of the hush. This shows that the history of Griggs is a history of the shadow, which fades when the source moves on. The relationship between the catalyst and the focus of the soul represents the refinement of the essence within the fall. In the shrine, the scholars turn souls into bullets of light, representing the conversion of life into will. The lore suggests that sorcery is the math of the soul. Its purpose was the weaponization of the internal energy. This reveals the clinical purpose of the shrine's classroom. The gods fear the sorcerer because the sorcerer discovered that the soul is not a sacred mystery, but a resource to be managed. This was the era of the Great Soul Arrow. The history of the catalyst is the history of the lens, which sharpens the blur of the cursed into a point of force. The lore of the dragon spies and the undercurrent of secrets represents the espionage of the arcane within the narrative. Many of the spells and items sold by Griggs suggest that Vinheim used magic for assassination and theft, proving that intellectualism was often violence. The lore suggests that the Dragon School is a silent threat. Its purpose was the maintenance of geopolitical power through the hidden. By residing in the shrine, the scholars kept watch over the chosen undead, ensuring that the prophecy benefited the academy. This reveals the Machiavellian purpose of the refuge. Even in Sanctuary, knowledge is a dagger hidden in a scroll. This was the era of the fall control. The act concludes with the silent observation of the abandoned catalog, as Griggs eventually leaves the shrine to follow Logan into the madness of the archives, realizing that logic cannot save him from obsession. The purpose of the intellectual refuge lore was to be the universal exposure of the limit of human reason. It shows that understanding is not salvation. The player realizes that Firelink is a memory of a school that has already failed. The rise of the crystal sorcery is the final movement of the Vinheim lore, proving that in the world of Dark Souls, genius is not a cure, it is a fast track to the hollow state dressed in the robes of discovery. The legacy of the sorcerers in this chapter is the horror of the academic migration. We realize that wisdom was a cold, calculus and magic was a tether that the Dragon School used to anchor the ego to the fading light. The purpose of the workshop of the stairwell was to quantify the void, and the fall was the crystallization of the human mind. As the blue light glows against the gray stone and the books rot in the damp, hearing the scratching of the quill echoing through the ruin, they understand that the history of Firelink is the history of the question, a question that seeks the infinite but leaves the thinker to starve in the answer. The 7th chapter in our 10-part chronicle of Firelink Shrine moves to the edge of the hearth, where the physical architecture of the shrine's outer retaining walls becomes a campsite of equality. This is the narrative elemental kinship, where the warmth of the bonfire is shared not with lords or scholars, but with an exile from the great swamp. Within the damp reeds and the flickering orange glow, Laurentius of the great swamp witnesses the final gentleness of the dying age. The lore of this era is the lore of the internal flame. Its purpose was the democratization of the soul's power. The history of the pyromancer is the history of the primitive truth, where fire is not a god to be linked, but a part of the body to be nurtured and shared. This is the tragedy of the honest heart, proving that friendship is a flame that warms the spirit but attracts the moth to the deep. The lore of the Great Swamp and the Outcast's art provides the cultural foundation for this chapter's presence. Pyromancy is the poor man's magic, a primal sorcery born from the mud and rot, representing the human connection to the chaos of nature. The lore suggests that the swamp is a sanctuary for the unwanted. Its purpose was the preservation of the forbidden flame. Because the Way of White and the Dragon School looked down on pyromancy as uncivilized, the pyromancers developed an ethic of sharing, proving that power is vibrant only when it is given freely. This reveals the communal purpose of the shrine's new guest. The swamp doesn't produce soldiers, it produces family. This was the era of the tattered cloth. This shows that the history of Laurentius is a history of the gratitude, which repays rescue with knowledge. The physical environment of the shrine's perimeter provides insight into the peripheral comfort of the fall. This is a liminal space between the safety of the fire and the danger of the graveyard, representing the life of the outsider. The lore of the mossy ledge explains that its purpose was the spatial manifestation of social status. Laurentius sits away from the clerics and scholars, accepting his place on the fringe, proving that even in the end, the social hierarchy of Lordran persists. This reveals the humble purpose of the pyromancer's anchor. The fire belongs to the low just as much as the high. This was the era of the swamp ring. This shows that the history of the ledge is a history of the inclusion, which turns the edge into a home. The relationship between the pyromancy flame and the part of the self represents the biological soul within the fall. Unlike a catalyst or a talisman, a pyromancy flame is cultivated from the wielder's own vitality, representing a symbiotic relationship with the element. The lore suggests that the flame is a child of the body. Its purpose was the union of the physical and the arcane. Laurentius gives the player a part of himself, proving that in the swamp, spells are not scripts, they are gifts of existence. This reveals the intimate purpose of the instruction. To teach pyromancy is to share one's own heat. This was the era of the fireball. The history of the flame is the history of the spark, which ignites the heart to shield the skin. Furthermore, the lore of the ethics of the swamp and the fear of the chaos represents the philosophical restraint within the fall. Laurentius warns the player not to let the flame consume them, representing the fear of the Witch of Izalith's mistake. The lore suggests that pyromancy is a double-edged blade. Its purpose was the mastery of the internal chaos. This reveals the cautious purpose of the shrine's teacher. The fire is a friend that can eat its owner. This was the era of the flash sweat. This shows that the history of Laurentius is a history of the temperance, which protects the human from the god. The relationship between the Kaelana mystery and the final quest represents the fatal curiosity within the fall. If the player tells Laurentius about the great swamp sorcery found in the Blight Town, he leaves the shrine to find it, representing the inability of the human to resist the source. The lore suggests that the departure was an ironic doom. Its purpose was the demonstration of the corruption of the innocent. By seeking the mother of pyromancy, Laurentius fell to the swamp he loved, becoming hollow in the mud. This reveals the tragic purpose of his ambition. Even the purest soul cannot survive the origin of the chaos. This was the era of the great chaos fireball. The history of the departure is the history of the descent, which pulls the teacher into the sludge. The lore of the hollowed pyromancer and the death of the friend represents the emotional weight within the narrative. The player eventually meets Laurentius in Blight Town, but he is mindless, forcing a duel with the only person who treated him with kindness. The lore suggests that the fight is a betrayal of the memory. Its purpose was the final severing of the social bond. By killing Laurentius, the chosen undead extinguishes the last sincere voice in Lordran, proving that isolation is the ultimate law of the fall. This reveals the devastating purpose of the duel. In the end, you burn the hand that warmed you. This was the era of the fire tempests. The act concludes with the silent observation of the empty ledge, as the moss grows over the spot where Laurentius once sat, realizing that Lordran has lost its heart. The purpose of the primordial pyromancer lore was to be the universal exposure of the fragility of human kindness. It shows that empathy is a sacrifice. The player realizes that Firelink is colder without the swamp man. The rise of the chaos flame is the final movement of the pyromancy lore, proving that in the world of Dark Souls, friendship is not a shield, it is a memory that is burned away by the gravity of the prophecy. The legacy of the pyromancer in this chapter is the horror of the elemental kinship. We realize that warmth was a fleeting mercy and fire was a tether that Laurentius used to anchor his loneliness to the slayer. The purpose of the workshop of the ledge was to nurture the spark, and the fall was the consumption of the giver. As the smoke rises from the bonfire and the mud claims the bones of the exile, hearing the hiss of the flame in the rain, they understand that the history of Firelink is the history of the hearth, a hearth that warms the body but leaves the soul to hollow in the cold of the origin. The 8th chapter in our 10-part chronicle of Firelink Shrine moves just beyond the northern archway to the echoing chamber of the Undead Parish transition. This is the narrative mechanical vitality, where the physical architecture of the stone tower becomes the pulses of the world. Within the clang of hammer on steel and the heat of the forge, Andre of Astora witnesses the final maintenance of the dying age. The lore of this era is the lore of the Titanite secret. Its purpose was the physical reinforcement of the human will. The history of the blacksmith is the history of the smith of the gods, where progress is measured not in souls or spells, but in the sharpness of the blade and the strength of the shield. This is the tragedy of the eternal labor, proving that hope is a cold iron that requires infinite striking to hold its edge against the abyss. The lore of the heritage of Astora and the smith's lineage provides the cultural foundation for this chapter's resilience. Andre is a remnant of a noble land, representing the duty that survives the fall of the kingdom. The lore suggests that the blacksmith is the sovereign of the material. Its purpose was the translation of divine power into physical form. By working the Titanite, a gift of the gods, Andre ensured that the undead were not defenseless against the terrors of Lordran. This reveals the foundational purpose of the smith's presence. The gods provided the flame, but the human provided the steel. This was the era of the large ember. This shows that the history of Andre is a history of the durability, which refuses to hollow as long as there is work to be done. The physical environment of the parish tower provides insight into the industrial despair of the fall. This is a fortress of utility positioned as a bridge between the shrine and the forest, representing the necessity of preparation. The lore of the roaring furnace explains that its purpose was the spatial manifestation of the world's friction. The heat of the forge is the only warmth in the parish that doesn't come from a lord soul, proving that industry is the sanctuary of the working man. This reveals the pragmatic purpose of the smith's anchor. The anvil is the only altar that actually answers the prayer for survival. This was the era of the repair box. This shows that the history of the tower is a history of the resistance, which matches the strength of the hammer against the entropy of the time. The relationship between the embers and the lost arts of forging represents the recovery of the divine script within the fall. To evolve a weapon, the smith requires embers hidden in dangerous places, representing the loss of information during the war. The lore suggests that the ember is solidified knowledge. Its purpose was the restoration of the blacksmith's potential. By finding the divine or chaos embers, the player restores the smith's library, proving that in Lordran, progress is a reclamation of the past. This reveals the collaborative purpose of the forging. The slayer finds the dream, and the smith makes it real. This was the era of the dark ember. The history of the ember is the history of the spark, which ignites the potential of the cold lump. Furthermore, the lore of the Titanite demon and the failed creation represents the dangers of the craft within the fall. Beneath the smithy lies a faceless demon forged from Titanite, representing what happens when the material gains a soul of its own. The lore suggests that Titanite is volatile divinity. Its purpose was the warning against the arrogance of the maker. This reveals the cautionary purpose of the smith's workshop. The tools of salvation can become the instruments of extinction. This was the era of the catchpole. This shows that the history of Andre is a history of the control, which keeps the demon locked in the basement. The relationship between the divine weapons and the war against the dead represents the theological armament within the fall. Andre is the only living smith who can ascend weapons with divine power, representing his last ties to the way of white. The lore suggests that the divine blade is a weapon of permanent rest. Its purpose was the neutralization of the necromantic infection. By forging these arms, Andre allows the undead to clear the catacombs, proving that steel can enforce the laws of nature when the gods fail. This reveals the holy purpose of the smith's skill. He is the exorcist of the anvil. This was the era of the occult club. The history of the divine forging is the history of the sanction, which blesses the violence to end the horror. The lore of the statue smiths and the petrified legacy represents the finality of the craft within the narrative. Across Lordran, petrified smiths hold legendary embers, representing those who gave everything to their work until they became stone. The lore suggests that the smith eventually becomes the anvil. Its purpose was the demonstration of the total devotion. By taking the embers from these corpses, the player passes the torch to Andre, proving that he is the last active hand in the universe. This reveals the mournful purpose of the succession. To sharpen your sword, you must loot the dead of their life's work. This was the era of the crystal ember. The act concludes with the silent observation of Andre's hammer, striking the iron with perfect rhythm even as the world ends, realizing that he will never stop until his arms turn to ash. The purpose of the divine blacksmith lore was to be the universal exposure of the necessity of the grind. It shows that maintenance is victory. The player realizes that Firelink is stronger because of the man in the tower. The rise of the maximized weapon is the final movement of the Smith lore, proving that in the world of Dark Souls, resilience is not a miracle. It is a repetitive labor that is hardened by the will to continue. The legacy of Andre in this chapter is the horror of the mechanical vitality. We realize that reliability was a sweaty defiance, and iron was a tether that Andre used to anchor the sanity of the Slayer to the reality of the battle. The purpose of the workshop of the anvil was to sustain the edge, and the fall was the exhaustion of the material. As the sparks fly into the dark and the hammer rings against the steel, hearing the rhythmic thud echoing through the parish, they understand that the history of Firelink is the history of the hammer, a hammer that shapes the future but leaves the smith to strike the same metal until the sun goes out. The 9th chapter in our 10-part chronicle of Firelink Shrine moves to the edge of the aqueduct, specifically the stone bridge where the physical architecture of the sanctuary meets the lower berg. This is the narrative curated desolation, where the debris of the divine is sorted, sold, and displayed as luxury. Within the golden armor and the bizarre jewelry, Domhnall of Xena witnesses the final commercialization of the dying age. The lore of this era is the lore of the cultural vulture. Its purpose was the recommodification of the lordly legacy. The history of the Merchant of Xena is the history of the Scavenger King, where victory over the gods is reduced to a financial transaction, and the uniforms of the lords become the costumes of the successor. This is the tragedy of the aesthetic void, proving that history is a garment that the living strip from the dead to feel significant in the shallows. The lore of the land of Xena and the eccentric aesthetic provides the cultural foundation for this chapter's presence. Hailing from a land of gold and knowledge, Domhnall represents a people who value the unusual and the rare above the sacred. The lore suggests that Xena is the Antiques Roadshow of the Abyss. Its purpose was the preservation of the material history through avarice. By collecting the trinkets of Lordran, Domhnall ensured that the style of the gods would outlast their power, proving that vanity is the only human impulse that doesn't falter during the hollowing. This was the era of the crystal shield. This shows that the history of Domhnall is a history of the appreciation, which sees art where others see ruin. The physical environment of the aqueduct bridge provides insight into the peripheral opportunism of the fall. This is a no-man's land between the shrine and the danger, representing the middleman's survival. The lore of the sitting merchant explains that its purpose was the spatial manifestation of the neutral observer. Domhnall sits on the outskirts, neither holy nor profane, watching the chosen undead kill the great so he can loot the remains. This reveals the parasitic purpose of the merchant's perch. The commerce of the shrine thrives on the graves of the elite. This was the era of the Master Key. This shows that the history of the bridge is a history of the market, which values the armor more than the man who wore it. The relationship between the boss armors and the theft of identity represents the metaphysical plunder within the fall. After the player slays a lord or knight, Domhnall offers their armor for sale, representing the demystification of the divine. The lore suggests that the armor is a skin of authority. Its purpose was the tactical appropriation of the enemy's legend. By wearing the steel of Artorias or Ornstein, the undead becomes a ghost of the past, proving that in Lordran, identity is a suit you buy with blood. This reveals the cynical purpose of the merchant's inventory. The hero is nothing but a mannequin for a dead world. This was the era of the crystalline catalyst. The history of the armor is the history of the costume, which hides the hollow inside. Furthermore, the lore of the wisdom of the odd and the hint of the serpent represents the information trade within the fall. Domhnall sells hints and advice about the depths and Blight Town, representing the practicality of knowledge. The lore suggests that Domhnall is a saner version of the crestfallen warrior. Its purpose was the demonstration of success through detachment. Unlike the warrior who gave up, Domhnall found a new goal in collection, proving that obsession with objects can stave off the hollowing of the mind. This reveals the protective purpose of the collection. The merchant lives because he doesn't care about the fire. This was the era of the gold pine resin. This shows that the history of the information is a history of the survival, which turns secrets into gold. The relationship between the crystalline armor and the infection of wealth represents the material decay within the fall. Domhnall sells crystal items that are powerful, but cannot be repaired, representing the disposable nature of luxury. The lore suggests that the crystal is greed manifested. Its purpose was the illustration of the fragility of the material. This reveals the ironic purpose of the inventory. The rich buy the best steel only to watch it shatter after a single battle. This was the era of the crystal greatsword. The history of the crystal is the history of the vanity, which shines bright before it breaks. The lore of the eye, Silmi, and the universal greeting represents the persistence of culture within the narrative. Even as Lordran ends, Domhnall greets the player with warmth and politeness, representing the undying nature of human mannerisms. The lore suggests that the greeting is a social shield. Its purpose was the normalization of the apocalypse. By acting as if everything is fine, Domhnall maintains the reality of the transaction, proving that the economy is the last structure to collapse. This reveals the desperate purpose of his friendliness. The merchant must believe in the customer to believe in the future. This was the era of the bottomless box. The act concludes with the silent observation of Domhnall's gold, glinting on the edge of the ruin, while the rest of the world is gray, realizing that he is the curator of a museum with no visitors. The purpose of the Scavenger's Perch lore was to be the universal exposure of the futility of possession. It shows that history is loot. The player realizes that Firelink is a thrift store for the gods. The rise of the merchant class is the final movement of the Xena lore, proving that in the world of Dark Souls, wealth is not a solution, it is a distraction that is accumulated while the flame goes out. The legacy of Domhnall in this chapter is the horror of the curated desolation. We realize that collection was a materialist madness, and gold was a tether that Domhnall used to anchor his sanity to the trinkets of the fallen. The purpose of the workshop of the bridge was to inventory the end, and the fall was the commodification of the tragedy. As the coins jingle in the wind and the gilded armor rots on the shelf, hearing the cheerful greeting echoing through the aqueduct, they understand that the history of Firelink is the history of the scavenger. A scavenger that polishes the past but leaves the world to suffocate in the dust of its own treasures. The final chapter in our 10-part chronicle of Firelink Shrine ascends to the hollowed heights of the sanctuary's ruins. This is the narrative cyclical connectivity, where the physical architecture of the shrine, specifically the giant nest perched atop the crumbling tower, is revealed as a bridge of time. Within the shattered masonry and the coarse straw, the giant crow witnesses the final repetition of the undead prophecy. The lore of this era is the lore of the transcendent ferryman. Its purpose was the execution of the spiritual transition. The history of the crow's nest is the history of the recursive journey, where Firelink is not just a destination, but a loop that connects the beginning, the asylum, to the middle, the shrine, and eventually the end, the kiln. This is the tragedy of the infinite orbit, proving that escape is an illusion designed to return the prisoner to the starting cell. The lore of the crow as the hand of Velka provides the mythological foundation for this final act. While many believe the crow is a servant of the sun, the lore suggests it belongs to Velka, goddess of sin, representing a natural law that transcends the lords. The lore suggests that the crow is a sanctioned anomaly. Its purpose was the delivery of the catalyst to the hearth. By plucking the undead from the asylum and dropping them at Firelink, the crow initiated the mechanical motion of the prophecy. This reveals the merciless purpose of the shrine's entrance. The chosen one is not rescued, they are extradited to the world of duty. This was the era of the black plumage. This shows that the history of the flight is a history of the sentence, which turns the sky into a pathway for the damned. The physical environment of the high tower nest provides insight into the atmospheric déjà vu of the fall. To return to the asylum, the undead must curl into a ball and wait, representing a regression to the fetal state. The lore of the hidden passage explains that its purpose was the spatial manifestation of the backstory. Firelink hides the way back home, proving that the shrine and the prison are two sides of the same coin. This reveals the nihilistic purpose of the shrine's layout. The hero must go backward to understand why they can never go forward. This was the era of the peculiar doll. This shows that the history of the nest is a history of the mirror, which reflects the asylum in the heart of the sanctuary. The relationship between Snuggly the crow and the alchemical exchange represents the metaphysical barter within the fall. In the second nest, a hidden voice trades items for spiritual treasures, representing the irrational economy of the void. The lore suggests that the exchange is a correction of the soul. Its purpose was the conversion of the physical remnant into the magical essence. By giving a dung pie for a demon titanite, the crow mocks the value system of the lords, proving that in the abyss, garbage and gold are equal. This reveals the chaotic purpose of the nest's commerce. The world is being unmade through absurdity. This was the era of the rubbish. The history of the exchange is the history of the alchemy, which turns waste into wonder. Furthermore, the lore of the stray demon and the lingering past represents the unfinished business within the fall. When returning to the beginning, the player finds a demon patrolling the floor beneath their original cell, representing the persistence of the chaos. The lore suggests that the asylum is a fossil of the flame. Its purpose was the containment of the failed prototypes. This reveals the cyclical purpose of the journey. To succeed in Firelink, the undead must confront the demon they ignored in the first hour. This was the era of the slab. This shows that the history of the return is a history of the reckoning, which forces the slayer to cleanse their own birthplace. The relationship between the Oscar's hollowing and the death of the ideal represents the final erosion of heroism within the narrative. The knight who rescued the player from the asylum is found hollowed upon the return, representing the inevitability of the fate he escaped. The lore suggests that Oscar is the predecessor's shadow. Its purpose was the illustration of the cost of hope. By killing the man who gave them life, the chosen undead accepts the solipsistic nature of the prophecy, that there is only room for one survivor in the fire. This reveals the cruel purpose of the asylum's lore. The past exists only to be put to rest by the present. This was the era of the crest shield. The lore of the infinite loop and the new game plus represents the eternal stagnation within the fall. After the flame is linked or left, the chosen undead awakens back in the asylum, starting the flight to Firelink once more. The lore suggests that Firelink is a waiting room for eternity. Its purpose was the trapping of the hero in a perpetual cycle. This reveals the universal purpose of the shrine. It is the safe point of a cosmic cage. This was the era of the soul of cinder. The history of the loop is the history of the treadmill, which allows the gods to burn the same soul over and over again. The act concludes with the silent observation of the chosen undead curled in the nest, waiting for the crow to take them away once more, realizing that Firelink is the only home they will ever know. The purpose of the Eternal Return lore was to be the universal exposure of the futility of the escape. It shows that freedom is a spiral. The player realizes that Firelink is the center of a maze that always ends where it begins. The rise of the next cycle is the final movement of the Firelink lore, proving that in the world of Dark Souls, destiny is not a path. It is a circle that is drawn in the ash of the previous failure. The legacy of the nest in this final chapter is the horror of the cyclical connectivity. We realize that home was a temporary perch and travel was a tether that the crow used to anchor the cursed to the repeating tragedy. The purpose of the workshop of the nest was to archive the loop, and the fall was the exhaustion of the linear time. As the wings beat against the gray sky and the shrine fades into the distance, hearing the squawk of the messenger echoing through the void, they understand that the history of Firelink is the history of the return, a return that saves the body from the dark but leaves the soul to link the fire for an eternity of sunless days.